Let's touch on something that has been discussed over the last couple of weeks, and that is Jota and whether Celtic should make him a permanent signing. 6.5 million it would cost to make him a permanent signing, and I'm going to lay my cards on the table right now. I do think Celtic should sign him. I think I've seen enough of him as a player in multiple competitions to say I believe Celtic should sign him. James, you were writing differently in the Celtic way during the week. So lay your cards on the table. Explain to us why you think it might be a risk.
Right. So let me first preface this by saying that he's been tremendous. I enjoy watching him as a fan. I mean, the entertainment value and his performance levels have been really good, particularly in attack. My point is more a top-down organizational one. I mean, if we think of this from how are Celtic going to build a team that's of a level that I think most of us want, which is truly competing at the European level along with our peer group, the Portos, the Benficas, even ignoring kind of that next rung of the Ajax and Salzburg, is I think there's certain organizational type decisions that we've got to make. And one of them is tilting more towards optimizing resources. So I think within that context, I think a question is, well, is signing someone like Jota's profile, as good as he's been, and as good as he probably will be if we sign him permanently, is that good enough from an optimization perspective? And I think that's where the risks come in and the questions come in. So the other thing I've done is kind of benchmark his performance so far. So I think the first thing that we need to do when you're looking at this kind of thing is he's been good. But okay, well, how good? What does that mean? What's the context, right? What's his age? What's his likely development curve going to be? What's his likely resale going to be within that context? So all those things fit within kind of the organizational structure. His fit with Ange's system is another component to all of this, right? So I compared him to Kyogo because in my mind, Kyogo checks a lot of those boxes. He doesn't really check the age one. He's a little old for our model, right? So that's, I think, partly why we got him for the price that we did. And an issue in the Japanese market, given their culture and how late players there tend to kind of get first team game time, it appears. And I've all learned in the last 6 months that I didn't know anything about before. So the market's moving towards valuing younger players higher. So like 18, 19, that's where the premium money's going, right? That's how an Ajax and a Salzburg are outperforming, because they're spending their $6.5 million on 18-year-olds. They're not spending it on 22, 23-year-olds, right? That's when they're selling their players. So that's a question structurally, right? So we've already gone old in the modern game with Starfelt, with Kyogo, obviously with Hart. I mean, if you look at the transfer window, the only one that would even theoretically fit that model is Abada, right? So he's coming at 19. He's now 20. Okay, so that's the only one that kind of fits with that. It's kind of a premium prospect where you're outlaying real money to pipeline high-end talent, like a Edouard was when he came in, or like a Frimpong was when he came in. So that kind of a higher tier of talent, getting it earlier. The next part is benchmarking his performance. So he's basically been somewhat comparable to kind of peak Forest, kind of 18, 19 Forest, and a little bit below what Sinclair was, let's say, in 16, 17. Okay, as if you measure that relative to just kind of like, as Alan would call it, scoring contribution, XG and XA, that kind of thing. And I do it in various ways. If you just kind of take the number, but then if you also take it as a percentage of the output of the team, because that kind of normalizes a little bit for style of play, right? Because the 18-19 Rodgers team was not as all-out attack as, let's say, this season so far has been for under Ange. So there's all kinds of different ways to normalize these things and take a look. And there's no question he's been very good. The question is it good enough given his fit, given all those other strategic things that I've talked about? Mm-hmm. Is the upside in payback going to be enough, right? Would I rather have two 18-year-olds at $3 million that maybe fit Ange's system a little bit better? And I think the big issue there is pressing so far. So that's kind of the thought process. It has nothing to do with whether he's a good player or not. He's objectively a good player.
So can I hop in and ask a question here just on that? Is your worry that he won't develop enough for us to get enough value out of him when we eventually sell him on? Because let's face it, that's the idea of what Celtic have been doing, that it wouldn't be worth taking the risk on the 6.5 million. You're thinking the value of return wouldn't be high enough. Is that your general point?
I mean, we could let's say we sign him at 6.5 and we sell him for 15. Is that good or bad? It is what it is. It's not the kind of outlier move in value that our peer group is enjoying, right? When they spend 6.5 on an 18-year-old, they sell them for 50 or 40, right? So it's a scaling issue. It's what's the upside? Do I think he's going to go for 40 million? No. The other part of that is who's the counterparty. And I talked about this before. When we sold Frimpong, he went to Leverkusen. When we sold Klamala, who's had a good season, by the way, because I watched him some on Red Bull New York, he went to Red Bull. Ayer went to Brentford. And in each of those cases, those are relatively smart teams. So who would we be buying Jota from? Well, it would be from one of the teams that were supposedly trying to ascend as a peer, and they're selling him for some reason. I don't know what it is. I mean, I would think Benfica probably know him better than I do, and they've decided that he's surplus, and he hasn't played there much. So I'm not saying that means he isn't good enough. I'm saying that's context, right? So when I add all of these things together, I think that means the probability. And I always think in probabilities, and these things are black and white. It's what's the likelihood that he's going to be a 25, 30 million pound kind of sale in 2 years, I think is pretty unlikely. Could we make good money on him? Sure. But again, to me, that's not us optimizing. Now, the last thing I'll say is, given the state of Celtic, the recruitment team, how recruiting has been going, I don't, this is largely an intellectual conversation because, I take him, given the circumstances right now, over another McCarthy, over another, over another Abada. Again, the decision making in the process, I'd rather have another Jota than another Abada. So, there's a lot of nuance to my argument here. It's just if we're going to be a club that gets to that level, I think this is the kind of decision that's reflective of why we're not there yet, and that this isn't one that I would make, and I don't think a team like most of our peer group that we're aspiring to be would make. And in fact, one of those is on the counterparty side of this decision, potentially selling him to us.
Okay. Yeah, I'm not going to run with the headline to say that you think Jota is terrible and that that
would be absurd.
Yeah. Alan, do you want to hop in on this? What's your general thoughts? My first inkling on this is that potentially the context of the league has to be taken into account here, that of course Ajax and the rest of them are able to sell for 40 million because their league is respected a lot higher than the SBFL. And it's, Celtic have to produce a Kieran Tierney to get 30 million. And Kieran Tierney, if he's an Ajax player, might go for 50 million,
So, based on the argument that it's not optimal for that model, we are nowhere near operating to that model. Okay, so the Celtic are hugely successful in the context of Scottish football in selling talent over the last probably 10 years. Probably because of the proximity to the English market and the disdain with which Scottish football is held, we've probably not got as much money for the likes of Van Dijk and Wanyama than perhaps we would have done had we been in, Belgium, let's say. But nevertheless, in the context of Scottish football, there's never been, and it doesn't look like they're going to be a comparator for the success Celtic have had in being able to sell players and make a profit, and therefore, plug revenue gaps, if you can call it a gap, through not having Champions League football whilst continuing to kind of grow the football club. Having said all that, we're absolutely nowhere near the model that James talks about that you would see in place at Ajax and Benfica. We're years away from that. And I agree that should be our aspiration, and that's what we should grow towards. But we're at least 40 million a year in revenue short of where we would need to be operating at the level that they're operating, where they can buy 3 or 4 18-year-olds for 5 million a year and take a punt that one of them will turn into a 50 million player. We're nowhere near that. So we're going to have to, up our game again in terms of revenue somehow, and we're going to have to completely put coaching and recruitment and so forth and analysis in place that will unearth these and attract them to Scotland. And it's going to be a multi-year process to get that up and running. In the meantime, we've got to build a squad, and the squad is very thin and we're very short of talent. Now, to James's point about Benfica being a counterparty, not wanting to betray any confidences, but my understanding is Benfica have screwed up. Okay, somewhere something's gone wrong. There's no way this kid should be available for the money that he's available for. My very simple take on this, and you said it yourself, James, is if we pay 6.5 million today, we've got at least a 15 million player on our books tomorrow. And in the context of Scottish football, you'd always take that move. You'd always take that move. You'd be mad not to. We paid 9 million for Edouard. In normal times, we probably would have got 25 million for him had it not been for COVID and his contract situation. And I think we're looking at a similar kind of level of talent for considerably less money than what we paid for Edouard. He's still relatively young, 22. I did exactly the same as you did. I benchmarked him against actually Forest and El Unici. I looked at Forest and El Unici, and I looked at the 1920 season because that was a good season. That was probably peak Forest actually. So comparing a 22-year-old Jota with a 25-year-old El Unici and a 28-year-old Forest at the peak of his powers, he stands up pretty well. There's really nothing in most of the metrics, and he actually is well ahead. He's nearly at Frimpong levels of elite ball progression with the ball at his feet. Frimpong had that one super skill, that one superpower that got him a £13 million move. Jota's also got that superpower, but he's got other very strong attributes as well. His overall scoring contribution that James mentioned, which is assists plus goals, would although he doesn't look like he's going to be as prolific as Forrest. Got 16 goals that season. El Unici, as we know, was a good finisher. But if you add in goals and assists, expected goals and expected assists, El Unici is nudging towards 0.9 a game, which is higher than both of them. For context, Edouard was generally around one and a bit, around about where Kyogo is. So that for a winger, a creative winger, that's pretty good. Secondary assists, he's also very high on. His packing stats are blow the others out the water. And one of his great attributes is his ability to get on the ball. So one of the problems that you see, I think, is not ever been a strength of Forest's, and is definitely a weakness in Abada's, is his ability to get on the ball. Is his movement good enough to create space for himself? And then when he does create space, is his control and body strength good enough to maintain possession? Jota, it is. He might have nice hair, nice teeth, and a nice little metrosexual goatee going on, but he's actually quite a strong guy. His body strength is good. His balance is excellent. His speed is good. But his super strength, to me, and he comes out on top of all of the wide attacking players that we've had, is his ability to get on the ball. And as we know, when he gets on the ball, he creates chaos. He gives the ball away a lot. He gives up more crosses. He loses more passes than all of those players because he puts risk into the game. We've talked about this over and over again. When you've got a midfield like Celtic have got now, of McGregor, Turnbull, Bitton, these are all safe players. Okay, you need players in the final third that are going to put risk into the game, and he does that in abundance, but he does it successfully as well. I think this is and forget the numbers. I just think he's a special player.
Right. So yeah. I'll rebut in two ways. First is that this is where I think system matters. So it's hard to normalize players that play in different systems, different managers, that type of different styles, that type of thing. So, for example, Forest in 1819 versus Forest in 1920. So just from again, this is analytical point and a conversational point, which is, okay, take Jota and compare him to an El Yunusi. How would El Yunusi produce in Ange's system this season? It's a theoretical question, right? But he we saw how much Christie kind of exploded with his output in a system that amplified his strengths. The second part that I wanted to mention, and I meant to mention this in my first my direct before the cross examination here, is one of the areas that I think football and analytics is still very virginal is on the defensive side. And quite frankly, that's not surprising. Even in baseball, it really hasn't been until the last 5 years, despite Moneyball being 20 years old now. It's really the last 5 years where baseball has exploded into defensive analytics. And that's been due to, the analogy with football is off the ball stuff, right? How do you quantify space and defend? Because defending is so much about space. As opposed to event data. And I think probably the best proxy that we have for that. Well, first of all, before I get there, defense is a huge part of the game, right? So how do you value that, and how do you quantify and measure that and that contribution, not only as an individual, but the network effect of team defending? And that's where in hockey, basketball, and they're probably a better direct analogy to football because of the fluidity of the game. And I think another issue for Jota is this is why I think Kyogo is the best analogy, is Jota is not in the same planet as Kyogo as far as that side of the ball. And Kyogo's, to me, that's what makes Kyogo an outlier signing. I mean, that you're getting the kind of attacking output that Jota's performing and offering, and you're getting elite defending and pressing in that position. And that's where I think, from a systemic perspective, if we get, 3 Kyogos up front, and that's where this Maeda guy, the rumor of him coming in potentially, where that seems to be one of his strengths. So this is the qualitative part of it, because we don't have great analytics there right now. The best I can come off of is looking at some pressure data and stats off of Statsbomb, and I don't have access to their off the ball metric called OBV because it's too expensive and I don't have access to it yet. But the way I can kind of infer things, Jota is at best an average player in that regard within the context of Ange's system, where that's amplified, meaning that the importance of that aspect of his position in Ange's system, it's not the same as playing on a counterattacking team, where the balance of his, the value of defense versus attack is tilted more towards kind of sitting back defensively. So going forward and defending from the front, creating chances off of that defending, I think is vitally important to Ange's system, the way I understand it to be. Kyogo fits that to a brilliant degree, and Jota doesn't. And again, so that's kind of my final argument, which is, in my mind, if we're gonna have kind of the top signing, because that would be at $6.5 million, to me, you get a 19-year-old who can play that way, who's optimal, basically look at Abada's age profile, but someone who can finish and press and can dribble and beat players off a dribble. Find those type of players, spend this $4, $5, $6 million on that kind of profile. You're going to, in Ange's system, because we've seen it with Abada, if they have the skill set at that age, they're still going to be able to produce at a European level. And then you also get the asymmetry of the higher potential sale value on the flip side. So because again, this comes back to a system thing too. I mean, we've seen this. I mean, I think that's part of why, and we'll talk about this in the next segment, that's part of why Ange has changed how we're playing, is because we're not defending from the front. And that's where I think, and the midfield is not pressing in his system the way, and we don't have a sweeper keeper, right? So he's a really smart guy. So he's done a lot of smart things to tweak the system to optimize more for the talent that he has. So to me, it'll be interesting. I don't really take managers saying, "Yeah, we want a player." I mean, they're never going to come out and say, "I don't want a player," right? I mean, that's not the way these things work. So I think it'll be interesting to see if they do sign him permanently, because to me, given everything I've read about Ange, I don't think he fits Ange's profile of the player that he would sign as the big time key position for his system.
So James, I mean, normally I'm with you, but I just think you're miles off on this one. I really do.
That's why I'm heterodox.
Yeah. So could you also, what I've found doing the Celtic by numbers thing, because obviously, as people may or may not know, probably do know by now, I collect my own data. I try and use the same definitions I opt to use wherever I can. I got my own some bespoke stuff, but generally speaking, I create my own data. The benefit of that is to be able to benchmark Celtic players through the years. Now, what I've found in looking at various different, mainly through trying to work out, do players play better in Europe or not, that type of conversation, what I found is that the standard of the opposition is by far the most predictive element in terms of how a player will perform, more so than any system or formation. Now, caveat that with, I think in certain cases with certain individuals, it clearly does matter. And Shane Duffy, that Enda and I were talking about before the show, certainly fits into that. On an individual basis, the way he was asked to play, given his skill set, wasn't conducive to getting the best performance out of him. But generally speaking, if you want to see, if you see how as a player is created more chances, scored more goals, etc., the quality of the opposition will be the most important aspect, over and above who the manager was and whether it was 4-3-3 or 4-2-3-1. So I don't accept that is a reason for not signing Jota. And secondly, every player is a trade-off, right? You're going to make a trade-off for whoever you sign. Celtic are not in the market for buying the finished article at 18 that has got 15 plus out of 20 on every attribute on FIFA or whatever it is, or Championship Manager, right? It's just not going to happen. It doesn't work like that. This is a guy who's got, potentially elite level attributes in the most difficult part of the game, which is creating chances and scoring, right? That is the hardest thing to do. If we had an attack that consisted of 3 Kyogo clones, we wouldn't score any goals because there would be nobody to create the chances. It's not how you can't build a football team like that. And when you think, the last point is, when you look at the context of the team that we have today, okay, we do not have enough risk-taking creativity. I'm not going to say we don't have enough creativity. That's not accurate. We don't have enough risk-taking creativity in the side with the midfield that we've got, and Jota gives us that in abundance. And I think he's crucial to the way that the team is playing and to the success we're having in an attacking third so far this season.
Mm-hmm. Final point on this, James?
Yeah, I agree with all of that. My point is more so, I shouldn't say I agree with all of that. I agree with his importance in attack. Where I would disagree is I don't think there's anything unique about him. I think he's, a very good player in that regard. But as Sinclair's 16-17 season in the Champions League at a much higher level against better teams was better than what Jota's been doing at a.
But he was 29. He was 29 years old.
Oh no, I agree.
He was the absolute peak of his career. He was at his peak.
I don't disagree with that. But let me just finish the second point, which is I'm looking at it now. So Statsbomb benchmarks all kinds of stuff statistically. So within the Europa League, so far, and I run all kinds of radars relative to attack and defending and pressing and all that stuff. So far in his a little over 9 games, he's 24th percentile in possession adjusted interceptions. He is 82nd percentile in tackles, but he's only 27th percentile in defending dribblers. And he is 52nd percentile in pressures, possession adjusted pressures.
He's average. I'd accept that.
Right. So that's
but it's a bit like the same argument as saying, we'll sign a goalkeeper who's great at crosses because lots of teams in the SPFL ping crosses in. If that was the case, we would keep Barkas, because Barkas is the best goalkeeper at defending crosses, right? Now, pressures and regains, if you look across the metrics for a game, are a relatively small part of the game. I'm not demeaning the importance of it and the importance of style and what Postecoglou was trying to do. And I accept and I completely agree that Jota is at best average at that aspect. But that's the balance. That's the trade-off with him. Now what is compounding it is that neither McGregor, Turnbull, Rogic, Bitton are very good at that aspect of the game either. So it's a systemic problem that Celtic have. If we had players in the midfield like Christie who could do that part of the game well, the trade-off with Jota would be an absolute no-brainer, right?
I agree with that. I mean, you have that luxury if you have the systemic part that allows you to overweight part of your allocation of resources, let's say, to an outlier attacking player. Meaning that if you're going to have a luxury player, and I don't think Jota is that. I mean, I think he's proficient enough defensively. So it's a balance. But let me just read off the example of Kyogo. So Kyogo's 93rd percentile defending against dribblers, and 97th percentile in possession adjusted pressures. Right. So those are just two examples of that to me, to your point, Alan, they're low percentage, but because we don't have great off the ball or spatial statistics, to me, those are logical proxies for players that are using space in a way in pressing that are dynamic, and they're going to create problems for the opposition. And to your point, I think part of the reason, I think this is maybe a good segue, and I know you're trying to move us along here as the good host that you are, as Alan and I are duking it out here, is if you look at XG conceded so far, and this is before we play our two of our harder games in the Europa League group, it's not much lower than it was last season in the debacle that was the Europa League group last season. The difference is that we're creating twice the amount of chances, right? So again, the value of this attack versus defending, and doing it at a European level. So I think Jota's, and again, this is not a hill I'm going to die on, right? So like I said, if they sign Jota, this is why I qualified. I mean, given the state of Celtic right now, if they sign Jota, I think it's going to be a less than optimal decision, but way better than the vast majority of decisions that have made. And there's, it's that issue of at a European level, are we going to be able to defend front to back and create the attacking? And I think the pieces of that, I go back to my Jenga analogy all the time, is having those pieces shaped properly. And to your point out, if we have three stud midfielders who are Ange ball midfielders, then you can get away with a Jota in one or two of the spots up front. But we don't. So that's
it does. So last little point, it doesn't help that we keep ending up in a group with at least two top 5 league opponents.
Right.
Yeah.
Fair enough. Yep.
Well, that's what happens when your seating drops where Celtic is. Unfortunately, I'm gonna be the moderator and say that was a draw. I'm still on Team Jota. I still think Celtic should sign him. And I think, look, although this is a stats show, and I'm not disregarding the pressing stats, James, but I think if we get to the end of the season and Jota has 14 goals, 8 assists, Ange isn't going to be wondering if he's in the top percentile of pressing. I think he's going to see him as a real attacking threat and sign him.